If you set up an account and say you're a 13-year-old girl, the amount of stuff that will come to you about how you feel about yourself and issues around body image and, this latest trend around skinny top or, for example, just of one area. I don't see any of that stuff, but it's no surprise that, having that stuff bombarded at you on a daily basis is going to have a negative impact. This is happening in terms of what our children see on their screens. We think they're safe because they're in our houses, but actually, arguably, it's having very, very serious long-term negative consequences. So I'd like us to return to a time when our children can play outdoors.
Hi, welcome to Voices on the Edge of Change, episode 9. Today's guest is Baroness Luciana Berger, whose career has been defined by her work on mental health, public health, and social justice. Before joining the House of Lords, Luciana Berger served as a Member of Parliament for Liverpool Wavertree, where she became one of the UK's most recognised voices on mental health awareness and campaigning to bring the issue into political mainstream and improve support and services nationwide. Over the course of her parliamentary career, she's held a number of frontbench roles, including Shadow Minister for Public Health and Shadow Minister for Mental Health. She's worked on policies spanning healthcare, well-being and inequality. She's also widely known for her resilience and advocacy in the face of what's been significant personal challenges for herself, and she is constantly using her platform to speak out about anti-Semitism, online abuse, and a push for safer, more respectful discourse. Now, serving as a member of the House of Lords, Baroness Berger continues to champion mental health, digital safety, and the well-being of young people, which is contributing to the national debate on how we respond to the challenges of the modern online world. So, in today's conversation, I'm going to be discussing with her her work, her perspective on social media and young people, and the role the government plays in creating a safer digital environment. I am so honoured that she has agreed to join me on this episode of Voices of the Edge of Change. So all it leaves me to say is, Baroness Berger, welcome. So firstly, Luciana, thank you. I'm sure you don't really realise how relevant this is right now to have you on the podcast. I know we've been talking about it for a few weeks for you to come on, and I'm hugely delighted and humbled, really, for you to be on Voices on the Edge of Change, because you really are a voice on the edge of change. And we're going to get into why you're so much a voice on the edge of change right now. But before we do that, I just think for the listeners and the people listening into this podcast today, it'd be really useful, even though I've done an introduction, to just talk a little bit about what drives you, what got you to this point in life, and then we'll get into the challenges, clearly, that you're juggling right now in the House of Lords and personally.
There's so many different facets to that. Certainly, there's been some reports that say that I always wanted to get into politics. That isn't the case at all. I didn't know anything about politics until I got to university. I'd never studied it. When I went to school, you had the choice of doing geography or history at 14. I chose geography. I knew that I had some political connections in my family, but my immediate family, like my parents, we watched the news and that was about it in terms of thinking about wider politics. I was always very interested in community activity and charity at school. I was the one that chaired the charity committees and organised the visits to the old people's home close by to our school, doing all the volunteering. But in terms of actual national politics or party politics, that didn't come until a bit later when I started learning about it through student politics and getting involved in my local student union when I was a student in Birmingham. And that was kind of my entry into it. I was elected as the community liaison officer for the Birmingham University Guild of Students back in the early 2000s. I won't say the exact year, but I took on that role in what was the wake of the first ever ITV program, Neighbours from Hell.
Oh, right.
I don't think you need to have watched Neighbours from Hell to kind of work out what it's all about, but I was responsible for an area, a student area that was adjacent to a community that, it was a long-term community that had lots of challenges with the students, and it had been exacerbated by this terrible program that had captured on screen students behaving really, really badly. And that was from my relationships, how to bring people together, how to work with councils and local authorities, with residents association, police and fire service, how to bring people together, particularly when there's division and challenges. This was under the full spotlight of the national media, so it was a real baptism of fire in terms of trying to do something. And I feel like, in that role, I was able to make a difference. That's just one example of the things that I got involved in. And it was interesting, actually. I went, was at my child's parents' evening the other night for my 7-year-old, and the teacher said, that my son has a real sense of justice. And that was, I couldn't have heard anything better about one of my kids. But I think, that kind of sense of justice is something that I grew up with, and I think has driven me into politics and all the work that I've been involved in.
And what a great role model, right? I mean, how fantastic for your son to see you as that role model in life now, and actually purpose and legacy work that you're doing. And we're going to get into a lot around legacy work in a moment, but it's really interesting because I work with young people, and I think, one of the things I notice is this sense of what do you want to be? My daughter's just turning 27. I think only 2 years ago did she really wake up and say, I absolutely want to be a primary school teacher, like more than ever. And she'd had a lot of challenges to get there. So I think, and we're now learning that our brains don't form until the age of 25 as a minimum now. We also know, and I'm certainly experiencing this in the genre of life that I live in, that if I think where my daughter is at 27, she'd probably kill me for this, to where I was at 27, it's very different. I've been living on my own for many, many, many years and surviving, and she's still living at home. So, I mean, it's just a different time, isn't it? I mean, it's quite a different time for people.
Just I suppose it's just one thing, in terms of like my experience. I didn't take a linear route. I started, I had a gap year and I was working in industry. I started doing a computer science degree. And then, I went on to serve 10 years as a member of parliament in the House of Commons. And now I have the responsibility of being in the House of Lords. That wasn't the trajectory I anticipated or could have planned for. And I think even now more so than ever, certainly for the younger generation, that we don't have to take linear routes. That it's all about our values and what it is that drives us, and our kind of motivations that I think, ultimately, and passions that people should be really focusing on to take them to whatever space or sphere or field that they want to be in. And I think I'm a great example of, that it doesn't have to be like a traditional route.
And I think that's more important than ever now. I think that the opportunity that's offered to young people, and some of that is hard because we know how many young children are out of work at the moment, and the stats are pretty horrific. But I guess that sense of you don't have to have it all or know it all by 25, 27. Actually, life's a journey. And actually, I think, dare I say this, I think I'm finally coming into what I actually want to be and how I want to be in life. And that's taken me a very long time. So I think your point about it doesn't have to be linear. It's not one road. There's actually many pathways in life. And I love the fact that you are a phenomenal role model for that. And I thank you for sharing that here. So currently you've been involved in 2 major change initiatives with the government. I know we're only here to talk about one, but I do think it's important to highlight the work that you are doing. And I know that aside from whether the UK is ready for a social media ban for under 16-year-olds, you are also, is it leading or involved in, I think it might be leading, the assisted dying bill. Is that how?
So I'm very, very involved in this assisted dying bill. I mean, I've sat through all 70 plus hours of the committee stage. I was on the select committee that we were involved in the House of Lords that had 13 different panels of, evidence that was given. So I am very involved in the bill. I'm there to kind of raise concerns and to make sure that we've got the guardrails and safeguards in place. Informed by my 10 years as an MP, I'm most concerned about making sure that if we bring forward a new choice in this country, a new choice to pursue an assisted death, not something that I would choose for myself, but if others wish to choose it for themselves, that it has to be a genuine choice, and a choice that people are making of their own free will, and not a choice they feel compelled to make or that someone is trying to make for them. And I come to this, having worked with lots of, particularly women in their 70s and 80s and 90s who have been the victims of domestic abuse for an extended period of time. And unfortunately heard, and we don't like to talk about this, but people speak in the most unsavory terms about not wanting certain family members to still be alive. And on that basis, I think just we need to make it very clear, make sure that if we do have legislation, that it's safe, that we have safe legislation, and that people aren't subject to coercion or undue pressure or influence in making that decision, that it is a genuine choice. that they are making, or not a choice that they feel compelled to make, also because they don't have the care available or a hospice or palliative care opportunities. So that's what I'm really focused on as part of my work in the House of Lords at this time.
So, when I talk about voices on the edge of change, I don't think I could have asked for an most incredible role model here and person to come on my podcast when we talk about the challenges to create change and to lead really contentious conversations and the most difficult, actually. And I think, although you may not be leading that one, certainly the conversation around that will be incredibly tough. But we're not here to talk about that. That may be another podcast, Luciana, if you'll have me back again. For now, I really do want to concentrate on where we are in terms of social media content, how we're safeguarding our future generations. I suspect we may come at this podcast with a few different views. Very interestingly, I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm married into a heavily blended family. I'm actually Jewish like you, but I've married into a half Chinese Christian Buddhist family. And I have 9 grandchildren as well as 5 stepdaughters. And I say that because I feel quite responsible as a mother and a grandmother. And I'm seeing a multitude of different generations' views now around how social media is handled, whether that's through the kids themselves at home. And so I'm really, really fascinated by the conversation that we're going to have today. But let's start with, where do you think the government has come to so far in their current position on social media for under 16-year-olds?
So I can only give you like an assessment. Obviously, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the government, and perhaps be very clear to your listeners. I come at this thinking that we're now at the stage where we do need to have a minimum age for access to social media. I do believe that should be 16, and I feel that more than ever because I feel that other measures that we've tried to take, or legislation or regulators like Ofcom, haven't been adequate to the task. And I feel that social media is getting worse, not better, in terms of the content it's spewing out, and both the acuity of it and how bad it is, and the impact that it's having. So for all those reasons, I don't see it as a panacea, as the thing that's going to solve all our challenges, and certainly not the only thing that should be done. Forgive me, that bell that you can hear in the background, that's here in the House of Lords saying that the House is just about to start going into business, but I'm so delighted to be talking to you. So my view is very firmly at this time that looking at other countries also that are taking this action across the world, including Australia, which has already introduced a ban, Indonesia just been announced, Spain, France, etc., that, in the absence of robust action, that's something that we need. So there's been many people that have been involved in kind of raising these issues. Most recently, almost 250,000 parents and carers wrote to their MPs about this through a campaign called the Smartphone Free Childhood Campaign to support social media minimum age. And I think in response to that, the government now has come forward with a consultation, which is open for anyone to respond to. It's just opened, and people have a number of weeks. Anyone over the age of 10 can respond to collate views on all manner of things, including the possibility of a social media minimum age, but also the government's consulting on whether there should be changes, such as, for example, like a curfew being introduced about when young people can be on social media instead of perhaps a ban. What more should be done around, what if anything should be done around smartphones in schools, screen time, what the guidance and rules should be around screen time, and looking at things like AI chatbots as well. Not something we would ever be talking about until very, very recently. AI chatbots now that are responsible for young people harming themselves, and in the worst cases, taking their own lives. There's a myriad of complex challenges, of which social media is, I think, one of the greatest offenders, if not the greatest offender, in terms of the impact it's having on our young people. So the government's now collating views in response to the fact that, we had this amendment in the House of Lords, of which I was a co-sponsor, which called for the introduction of minimum age, and carried a significant majority in the vote in the House of Lords. So in response to that, and the government's come forward with announcing this consultation.
What are the dates, the clear dates of the consultation that's running for this?
So the government opened the consultation at the start of March 2026, and it's going to go on until towards almost the end of May 2026. So parents and carers and young people over the age of 10 have an opportunity to engage with that consultation, of which, there's a number of things and questions that are being asked. Some specifically around social media. Also, although some things are presented as social media, I wouldn't classify them as social media. There's kind of a box of things that could be positive uses of general online engagement, such as using Duolingo to learn a language, or to use WhatsApp, which, in other countries, WhatsApp hasn't been, like Australia, they have not included that on the list of social media. They use that as an example by which young people could communicate with their grandparents, for example.
Sure.
Or using, what is the example they use is using TikTok to do a dance. I would say that young people could do dances in real life. Yeah, so, but and anyone's been given the opportunity to respond to that consultation.
That's great, and I will come into I think a little later about because I'm preparing one of my founding businesses preparing young people for the world of work, and that's certainly one of the questions that's come up is this if this ban were blanket, and it sounds like it might not be, but if it were as strict as people had initially thought, how do we prepare people for the tools that they need for when they go into the workplace? But that's interesting.
And I mean, it's a really important question. So the first thing to say is, again, looking at the Australia experience, is that it's not a blanket ban on the internet or using apps or using technology. It's about specific platforms that currently push dangerous and harmful content to young people that they're neither searching for or seeking. It's about looking at those platforms that have algorithmic content, again, which can be very harmful and dangerous and is on a scroll, so the doom scrolling. It doesn't ever end. I remember a time when I would be on the platform X, formerly known as Twitter, where, you would finish looking at Twitter and that'd be the end of it. That is not the case for some of these social media platforms today. It's also about those platforms that enable and allow contact and engagement with strangers, which we know is particularly platforms like Snapchat that are, according to a report just out this week, are the most responsible for some very horrific things around grooming of children and young people. So it's a combination of all those elements. It's not saying that we shouldn't allow young people to use the internet or to engage. I mean, arguably, I would say that giving young people 3 years and more to build their community and identity offline is building their resilience and helping them more to prepare them for the world of work than suggesting that that you have to be on a social media platform in order to prepare for that. I think there's lots more things that can be done. There's also giving children part of their childhood back. It's about giving them more time with their friends to socialize. We're hearing reports from head teachers that say that young people are leaving their schools unable to engage in discussion or debate or to resolve conflict because they're so used to trying to do things online, which is where everything's distilled to just single sentences or even words, and that's making it highly problematic. So I would argue that actually we'll be doing more to help and prepare young people for the world of work by getting them off these platforms, especially when Ofcom says that on average, young people are spending 21 hours a week on them, that by actually moving them off social media, we're doing them a favor and helping them more to engage in that kind of wider world of work and into adulthood.
Gosh, yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I'm just trying to distill everything you've said. I mean, I think one of the things I would just take from what you've said just now is anybody that's been following me on social media over the last week, I did something on what I thought was a relatively safe platform. And this is business to business, business to customer, something that most businesses would use. It was a platform called Eventbrite. I am going to call it out because I'm calling it out online. I had 98% of the numbers in place. I can't say I had 100%, Luciana, but certainly had 98%. I did all the right checks and we got hacked, to be honest, because it's out there. We got porn put all across our meetings. It was utterly horrendous. One of the things I didn't actually realize, one of the reasons why I did go to the police after was because I didn't realize that the people in the film that we were being shown could even have been trafficked. It didn't actually surprisingly cross my mind, which I was mortified about when somebody mentioned it to me. These are adults in work environments, on safe environments, we thought through servers. So I think if it can happen in business, if it can happen in the world that we're in as adults, I think we do have to, I'm absolutely for a protection system. I guess one of the things I would just ask at this point, there was an article online from a head teacher actually, that I had worked with in the UK that now works in Australia, actually. So he's a UK person. He's gone over to run a school in Australia. And he wrote a really interesting article. His name's Jeremy Stodinder. He wrote a really interesting article about what it's been like to be a headmaster to implement the rules and regulations around the ban in Australia. And one of my takeaways from that was I don't know whether we would call it abdication, but this sort of sense that it was all down to the teachers now. It was all down to the education departments. Government had said, we're going to do this and we're going to do it this way. And it was almost like the parents had sort of just advocated responsibility to them for this and step away. How do you think we're going to manage that? How are we going to deal with the education bit? Because so it's a bit of a long-winded question, but my observation is I think a lot of parents actually don't really know how to cope with this and where to draw the lines as much as they know they need to. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
So there's a few things to say in response to that. The first thing is that in this country, two of the main teaching unions are supporting a minimum age of
Right.
16 for social media. That's the NEU, the National Education Union, and the NASUWT. And they're doing so because they report that the greatest issue for their teachers in the classroom that they have to contend with is issues around bullying and difficult social interaction that's happening on these platforms after school and over the weekend. And it's taking up an extraordinary amount of their time, and it's having a real impact on their abilities to make a difference in the classroom. And they say that it's impacting on retention and recruitment of teachers as well. So for them, it's a massive issue. And specifically on the smartphone ban in schools, which is also something that I would wholly support. I live in the London Borough of Barnet, where we are the first borough in the country to ban all smartphones for primary schools. And for each new cohort that's starting in year 7, and it started in this academic year, banning smartphones until the age of 14. And if you have that blanket ban, that's making a massive difference in schools. It's actually making it easier for teachers and for schools to know that there's no smartphones allowed. And in terms of also reducing the opportunity for young people to have that kind of engagement and some of the negative stuff that's happening via social media, it's making a big difference. So we've got examples of where it's already happening in this country to great effect. It's an effort that's needs to take place on. It's not just down to teachers. Absolutely not. I would argue that by introducing a minimum age, we're shifting some of the responsibility which needs to be placed on the social media companies themselves that so far have completely abdicated their responsibility by, even we're supposed to have minimum ages of 13 for certain platforms in this country, that just isn't happening. There's companies that have been fined, including TikTok, for example, for having hundreds of thousands of young people under the age of 13 on their platforms. They still haven't even paid their fine. So actually by introducing a minimum age again and having proper age verification rather than just someone self-reporting and saying that they're 13 or 16 or whatever, that will also introduce kind of more robust measures and make it easier, I would say, for schools and for parents. And it's actually, parents themselves that are crying out for this because they find it so difficult to try and navigate, what time my child can be on or off, right? Whether they have the smartphone, the pressure when someone else's child's got the smartphone, or the pressure when someone else's child is on Snapchat and my child isn't, and
Yes.
parents support it. If they're trying to protect their kids, but they're also getting, having very difficult circumstances. I can think of a number of parents that have told me, with their children, how difficult it is and how upset it makes them because they feel they can't fully contribute or, participate. Actually, if we make it blanket for all children and that's the expectation, then we're making it a lot easier for everyone involved.
Yeah, and talking as a grandmother, I've seen a much higher level of anxiety in two of my grandchildren in particular. One that now, well, certainly this Easter, didn't really want to come out of her bedroom. And I was really upset about that. I mean, really, it was just even trying to invite them over to support the parents on that. So,
But you raise the actual human experience of too many children and young people that are suffering because of what's happening online. You raise like a really important real life example. It's a family member that you have a young person who's unable to leave their bedroom, and that is a report that we're hearing from so many health professionals that are reporting about the experience of young people that are so impacted by what they're experiencing online that it's affecting their ability to socialize with their friends and their families and to leave their homes and go to school or to socialize outside. There are so many negative impacts that are being reported. It was quite unprecedented that there was a meeting that convened all the medical royal colleges in this country, and not often do they agree on
yeah,
things. Certainly on the issue and the impacts that they are experiencing in our emergency rooms, in their therapy rooms, in their inpatient mental health units, that there are too many children and young people in this country that are severely and adversely impacted by what they are experiencing on social media platforms, and be that the bullying or the sextortion or the exposure to harmful material, violent material, misogynistic material, pornographic material. You layer up all of these harms. And in the worst case examples, there's a growing group of bereaved parents in this country who have lost their children to what's happened on social media. That's the very worst examples. And we hope that we don't see more children added and more parents added to that list. But there's other things that we don't hear and see about because they might not make the national news, but are having massive impacts on children in their school communities and that parents are having to contend with. And this largely goes unreported, but this is the real life experience of far too many young people in our country.
And how do you cope with that as somebody who's having to listen to those stories? Because we're talking about real emotions here. I mean, I know how violated and horrified I felt this last week just running a live podcast on Zoom, right? And the responsibility I felt just to the people I didn't know that had come to my event and all the work I've done to get out of that, I suppose, at the end of the day. How do you walk away with that? Because that's a real responsibility, isn't it? Really, I guess, in your role. I'm just curious about how you deal with your emotions on that, because that must be so hard.
Well, this is what motivates me. It's about those human stories and that real life experience that are, so devastating and so shocking that mean that I'm wanting to campaign and to work on this issue, and to try and share those stories as I have done in the chamber at the House of Lords during the course of the debate, and to raise in private meetings with people making the decisions and to try and affect some change, because I just don't think we can wait any longer.
Yeah.
I think, we've got an Online Safety Act, which is already trying to catch up and still doesn't adequately contend with all the different elements I just set out in terms of the things specific to social media. And every day that passes, there's another child that's bullied. There's another child that has to move school. There's another child that is admitted into an inpatient mental health unit. There's another child that can't leave their bedroom. And this stuff is happening all around us. I think it's the urgency of the situation, the absence of anything that's going to, affect change quickly. I don't think it's, as I said at the start, I don't think it's the thing that's going to fix everything, but I certainly think in the absence of an alternative that we can switch on immediately. So I just think we don't have another choice.
And I think you hit on some really important points, right? Because I work in change. That's what I do. And one of the things at a conference last week that I was at moderating was the speed of change and the fact that we can't have all the answers. We don't know all the answers. We don't know what we don't know. We're asking leaders to step up with courage. That was very much what the program was about at this conference last week, with courageous leaders. And I think this sense of having real courage to stand like you are and making a stand for this and fighting the good fight. But the evidence, you talk about the evidence. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Are there, and if you don't have them to hand, that's fine, because it is, I didn't ask you before this podcast, but, some of the statistics that you're seeing with the rise of well-being, mental health issues in this country, because I hear from parents a lot of the time about, you can't get a meeting with plans maybe for 4 to 6 months. The waiting lists are enormous. The strain on the teachers. I think what you say about we can't get enough teachers, I've seen that just through the eyes of my daughter wanting to become a primary school teacher. And I also know what she's battling in school today with sickness from teachers and burnout because of the level of difficulty. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is they're having to deal with issues they weren't really trained to deal with, right? They weren't educated and trained to deal with these issues on top of the day job. So I just wondered if you had any startling statistics really to get people to wake up to why this is so important.
Well, I think just the amount of time that we know young people are spending online, as I said, it's 21 hours a week on average, just on social media platforms. That's not on any other form of internet. And again, what does that mean in terms of opportunity cost? 21 hours that young people could be sleeping more, 21 hours where young people could be building their self-worth and resilience rather than having it hacked away. 21 hours where they could be doing other activities that take them outside, outdoors, that can connect them human to human, and or can help with their educational attainment as well. Because there is evidence to suggest that our PISA scores, our scores around various educational attainments, historically kind of go up and not going up anymore in terms of what it's doing to our young people's ability to learn, or again the opportunity at time. There's certainly quite a few statistics about the increase in incidence of depression amongst teenage girls that can be charted. It's gone up very, very significantly. And so I don't have the number in front of me, but it's gone up. And the start of the increasing upward trajectory started with the introduction of the front-facing camera on a smartphone.
Yeah.
And then uh, types of social media that were introduced. And similarly, we're seeing a lot more children diagnosed with anxiety and depression than have ever been diagnosed before. We know now that a projected additional 800,000 young people are expected to be out of work due to mental ill health. And while some people say, well, you can't prove the causal link, certainly we know that there's a lot of evidence that's been done, including by Professor Daniel Einstein in Australia, who was provided a lot of the evidence in Australia, which led to the introduction of the minimum age in that country. If you bring together all the different pieces of evidence, it's very, very significant. There's over 100 different pieces of evidence that shows the negative impact of this stuff. So it's not a surprise, and it's not like people can say that it's anything else as well. So what else is it if it isn't this? Or not, of course, there's other external factors and pressures that young people faced in terms of climate anxiety, for example. You mentioned earlier about kind of employment, the lack of employment opportunities. But of course, this stuff has an impact. We're seeing it having a direct impact in children losing their lives. As I said, a growing group of very, very brave parents are speaking out about their own children's experiences on social media that led them to take their own lives or to engage in these different trials
Yeah.
that essentially are so dangerous that see them losing their lives as a result of it. And so it's the reports that we hear from those people in accident and emergency that are seeing young people present with most horrific injuries driven by what young people are seeing online in terms of sexual behavior, young people that might not lose their lives, but certainly incur very significant injuries because of how they're being motivated or what they're seeing online.
Yeah.
So some of this stuff is difficult directly document or to say categorically that it's because of social media, but hearing the testimonies and stories of both the parents of the young people affected, the young people themselves, and those medical professionals, both physical health professionals and mental health professionals, that are saying left, right, and center that this is the greatest contributing factor to the negative impacts on our young people. We have to take that stuff seriously. And I would argue that, in this country, we've got a proud history of adopting what's called the precautionary principle. If we think that something could harm our kids, then we say let's not stop and not allow it to be provided to them until we're sure that it's safe. And there's been a myriad of cases that have come out just even in recent weeks that show that behind the scenes, social media companies have aggressively deployed their algorithms and haven't put the safety controls in place or have removed the safety controls in your race to get the attention and eyeballs of our young people, ultimately in need of profit. And why should we why should we expect them to do anything other than put those businesses first before our children and young people? And essentially, it's our children and young people that are paying a massive price.
And of course, I mean, if I think about my childhood and even my daughter's childhood, because I think we scraped in probably 14 was when she was first becoming aware of something called BBL at the time, right? But I guess we've got baselines. We have baselines. You and I'm not older than you, I know that quite a bit, but we have baselines. Oh no, I'm really honestly offline. I'll tell you, I am seriously. But we have baselines. I grew up in an era where parents said to you, "Come back when it's dark." I have my bike. I went out. I just about, honestly, everyone's going to laugh when they hear this, but I just about had a CB radio. I think we were allowed at one stage of our life, and we didn't even have, gosh, I'm old. We didn't even have a telephone line put in until we could get Saturday jobs to afford to put it in. Right. So communicating was a real thing. You had to go find your person to talk to. You had to be invited to the party. And in fact, if you weren't invited to the party, you didn't know. And you didn't have it played out in front of you 25 times that you weren't there. And that, this thing about constantly seeing what the FOMO that we're creating unnecessarily for young people,
Yeah.
I think is tragic, actually. I've experienced it as a mother, right? I mean, this podcast is not about my daughter and me, but I've experienced it.
It's both the FOMO and also the need for validation via likes and shares.
Yes.
Actually, that doesn't, as I've listened to the experts and the researchers very closely, it actually doesn't help us in terms of our resilience or our well-being or our sense of self or our sense of self-worth. It actually hacks away at it. Like kind of that constant seeking for attention and or validation is actually at that age. And again, it speaks to the point you made at the start about how we now know that the prefrontal cortex of our brains doesn't fully develop till at least 25. It's no surprise that this is having a detrimental impact on our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've still got a few questions. I'm just wondering, I mean, aside from what you've said, and you've said so much, is there any other public data that you think the government needs to rely on now to get, or that they're relying on to hear, that they want to hear, I suppose? Not that I'm, by the way, just for the sake of this podcast, I'm not influencing any consultation here whatsoever. I just want to be very clear.
Well, I mean, but there's something to stop you influencing any consultation, and anyone can participate in it. And
Right.
I'd say the more the merrier. And and I'm also compelled by the fact I mentioned there was almost 250,000 emails sent to MPs in the week running up to the vote on the vote that we had to ban social media for under 16s. We know that polling shows in this country that 75% of the public want a ban.
Right.
That's unprecedented in
Yeah.
terms of policy securing support. Again, because people realize how bad it is and what a detrimental impact it is having, and that we need to be doing something urgently to deal with it. And again, I'd reassert, the point that this is it's not a panacea. It's not gonna fix everything. It's not the only thing we should be doing. Obviously, as technology evolves, there's lots more to do, and we should be looking at all the different elements and functionality that need to be addressed both for under 16s as well as over 16s.
Absolutely.
So that there's nothing to stop people from wanting to contribute and for us to be talking about it. I suppose to the challenges that have come up that have been put forward largely by tech companies. Some of the kind of challenges to why we shouldn't do it, and it comes back to the point I was starting to make before about the precautionary principle, particularly when it comes to how we should protect kids and their health, both their physical health and their mental health. Certainly it might be the case that we've got a ban on this country that you can't drink alcohol if you're under the age of 18, and you can't smoke cigarettes if you're under the age of 18. Now, of course, there's always going to be young people that will seek to circumvent that and will break the rules. But in terms of setting a cultural precedent and having a pause and a reset, I'm not saying that, you introduce a balance to be foolproof and that, there might not be some workarounds. I would say that if we look at the Australia experience, that they're very agile in their legislation. They can add things if they think that children are changing their habits. They're tracking the patterns to see if children are going onto different platforms.
Yeah.
So obviously things we can do to respond, but I would still say that having that kind of clear indication of what is good and what's helpful for young people, I think is a really important thing, can make a difference. The other argument that's been put forward about why we can't do this is because people say that if children come from certain minority groups, that they need to be online on social media in order to inverted commas, find their tribe. Sympathy with that argument. What I would also say, though, is that we know that the most vulnerable children are the ones that are most preyed on already online. And actually, these spaces, far from being safe, are actually some of them quite dangerous. And actually, if you're from a vulnerable group, you are 4 times more likely to be preyed upon, to be bullied online, to face extortion, all manner of really ugly and unpleasant things, to be attracted via county line crime, lots of different facets and lots of different issues. That's not to say we can't have safe spaces and that safe spaces shouldn't be created and protected online for vulnerable groups of young people. But the idea that we have to have them, I think, is actually not helping those children. We should be doing even more to provide them with safe spaces in the real world rather than online. And that actually, those are the very places that predators pursue in order to get those children most at risk.
In order to do this, look, I'm going to just backtrack on one thing that I want to come back to, not backtrack, but I want to come back to something that, as a change professional, you can't just get to the end game on day one. You can't say, oh, well, that's where we're going to be in 10 years, so we'll be there tomorrow, and we'll get there tomorrow. It's impossible. So I absolutely concur that you have to start somewhere. And I absolutely concur that it has to be irritating. I can never say that word. We have to keep changing it. We have to keep going. Sorry, I'm very dyslexic. You're going to have to forgive me some words. Just don't.
Well, I don't like that word either.
But that sense of we'll come up with something and we'll build on it and we'll build on it and we'll build on it. So, what we're trying to get to, I guess, really in terms of this conversation is a baseline that we can come out and say, look, for the moment, this is where we are. But I did notice, because obviously the bills tried to get through initially and it wasn't voted on as a majority in the House of Commons. And I noticed in one of the news outlets that, well, it was probably on every newsletter, but obviously I wasn't watching them all. Starmer has tried to put back the responsibility initially for the big tech companies to come forward. And do you think that's going to happen? I mean, you've already talked on this podcast about the fact that they're not doing what they need to do. You've got evidence of that. How far do you think he's going to get with the big techs on that?
But I don't have any faith that voluntarily
Voluntarily.
any platform would make any changes. I think unless they're compelled to, then for them it's all about all of our attention, because our attention and our eyeballs are a commodity in terms of our time and what that leads to in terms of advertising and people selling us stuff online, including children, because there's no limits to what our kids see on that front as well. So these are commercial organizations, and there are many spaces, commercial spaces, that have government intervention to protect kids and young people. And arguably, we're in a place and time. You mentioned, Lou, that about your childhood and growing up and being out on your bike and being out late. We're at a time, we're in this extraordinary moment where we control our children's experiences in real life to the nth degree.
Yeah.
The idea that any child under the age of 11, most parents wouldn't allow them to go out by themselves or go to the shop or to play on the road. And yet we give them unfettered access to the most extraordinary, horrific material on online spaces, and it's it's so extraordinary. And I would probably like the last year that I really had exposure to how much bad stuff is out there, because I don't see it on my timelines.
Sure.
But to understand, what is being fed to our children and to our teenagers online, and the volume of it and the acuity of it and just how damaging it can be, it's been really shocking. If you set up an account and say you're a 13-year-old girl, the amount of stuff that will come to you about that will affect how you feel about yourself, and issues around body image, and this latest trend around skinny talk, or for example, just of one area. I don't see any of that stuff, but it's no surprise that having that stuff bombarded at you on a daily basis is going to have a negative impact. This is happening in terms of what our children see on their screens. We think they're safe because they're in our houses, but actually, arguably, it's having very, very serious long-term negative consequences. So I'd like us to return to a time when our children can play outdoors and can socialize and spend more time finding themselves and building their resilience in real life, and shift to a moment where actually we realize how damaging this stuff can be. I think it's been I think our kids have been subjected to an experiment over the last 2 decades in terms of what.
I really think between COVID and this social media elements and the things that we're struggling with and behavior in schools, I mean, stories I'm hearing about the way 8-year-olds argue with teachers in a way that we didn't know. I mean, when my teacher used to come in the room, if I dared open my mouth, I wouldn't, I'd be down at the headmistress's office before my feet even managed to know where the shoes were. I mean, it was just the whole level of behavior, the way kids being brought up now is so detrimental, all of this. I guess a couple of things going through my head while you were talking about. And I think that what I'm seeing is, the innocence of young people turning into, as we've said before, a complete and utter anxious state. I think the sense of what we were able to do as young people when we were growing up and actually learn how to communicate and have empathy and to deal with situations outside of any social media and social groups, and learning how to understand different cultures and work with different cultures, because we were brought up in that way, and we were asked to contribute in different ways to understand, and be compassionate and build empathy in our own being. And that's actually, I think, empathy. That's a whole other conversation, but I think empathy is being stripped completely, actually, through algorithms. And because we are, as you say, I probably get a lot of makeup posts and my algorithms because I just have to buy something. I mean, you can see how you're being fed. I think the other thing I would just say, as we weren't seeing images, having come from a news agency myself over 25 years, right? Our children are being exposed to war, to news, to understanding the complexity of displacement and so much more, and the hatred, I believe, that can come from all of that content as well, in causing where we were getting what I thought London was quite a big melting pot, if I'm honest with you. New York, to me, actually was probably one of the biggest melting pots and is regressing massively. What is that doing to our diversity and tolerance in immigration and everything else that we're struggling with as a country now? And that's got to have had an effect, and it's going to have an effect on the next generation, surely. I mean, it must do. So,
I think all these things, yeah, in terms of, yeah, you layer up on top, these different elements. Yeah.
sorry, that was I guess I'm just taking in everything you're saying. And I guess what's hitting me with what you're saying is just how much this plays out into our society, how much this plays out into the future generations that are coming into our workplaces, and how much this will play out into decisions that are going to be made to our future. I think that's what it really boils down to me.
We haven't even really touched on, one of the biggest issues again, which as adults we're perhaps more able to discern, although there's certainly countless examples of where people aren't able to separate truth from fiction, and that's both the misinformation and disinformation that's largely peddled on these platforms, and also the rising incidence of misogyny. And we meet at a time when there's yet another documentary out about the manosphere and about, what's happening to our boys and men. And I saw some really disturbing headlines this week about, you know, how boys in school are treating their fellow female students and female teachers as well. And that we seem to be going backwards in terms of, equality for all genders, and how, we should be treating each other with respect, and how unfortunately that is not the case in terms of how a growing cadre of boys and men are being taught or learning how to treat women. And I think that's a massive concern in terms of what that means for relationships and or healthy relationships, and for keeping interaction and engagement going forward.
So, a couple of things for our listeners on that. That's the BBC Louis Theroux program that's been out in March. If anybody's, it's 26, if anybody's looking that back up. I've yet to see it, but I've been watching the headlines. So, can I just go back to one thing in terms of the consultation? Sorry, what age groups can start to have a view on the consultations? What is the age?
Anyone over the age of 10 can contribute to the conversation, yeah. I mean, and I think that does present a problem, because obviously if you're a young person under the age of 16 who already has access to social media, the prospect of not having it or having it taken away from you is quite challenging. I wholly accept that. And again, looking to the Australia experience and hearing about the first few weeks of implementation, how difficult it was, understandably, for young people to be told, actually, no, you can't use these platforms. But what has really also motivated and compelled me is looking at the polling of young people post 16 who themselves say that they wouldn't give social media to their own children because of the impact that it's had on them. The majority of young people say that they either support or ban. It's 53% of all young people. And for those aged over 16, it goes to over 60%. And there's an even higher percentage of young people over the age of 16 who themselves say that they would not give social media to their own children, or they'd try and hold it back for as long as possible, obviously reflecting on their own experiences. So, it's interesting, obviously, the government has included in the mix young people that will already have access at this time. But I'm very interested in the views of young people, but who are just out the other side, who themselves, the majority of whom say that they think a ban is a good thing, and would also, if they had children, would prevent them from accessing social media. So I make changes to everything. And the reason why I advocate for a ban is because, again, I don't think it's a perfect solution. I think it's an important step in the journey to, if these platforms, are able to change the technologies that they use, and to stop the doom scrolling, and to stop, this the harmful algorithmic content, and that, restricts risky functionalities and design features that we know are encouraging excessive use, such as infinite scrolling or autoplay. If they're able to do all of this stuff, then we'd have safe platforms for everyone to use, and that would be fantastic. But in the absence of that happening, that's why I think, having this reset would be an important step on that journey.
And I really love
And the
the word.
reset. The reset being, until they have corrected all of these damaging elements that are part of their platforms. That's why we need to have a minimum age of 16 plus in place.
And I think you use such a critical word there, Luciana, reset. And I think that, you know, when I was putting this together, when I was thinking about, part of me started off, yes, we've definitely got to have a social media ban. And then obviously I'm doing all this work on Work Ready Collective, and I'm hearing from all these kids, and I'm sort of wondering, is it a ban? But I think just again for the listener, what I think I'm taking away from this podcast is, the word that an opportunity for us to put in safeguards that are considered for all groups, regardless of who you are, the opportunity to look at this again, to bring big tech and desperately try to hold them to account, to try to change policies, laws, whatever it might be. And again, I think what I'm hearing from you, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but it won't all be right straight away, right? Actually, we can't just keep watching and allowing. We've got too much data. We've got too many people shouting at you, 75% of parents. The one question I have for you in this is whatever the reset looks like, whatever this new world looks like, and whatever we do to restrict, maybe the word is restrict rather than a total ban. But how do you see an education program being rolled out for parents? Because I would say that there's a lot of parents that still feel they're trying to play catch up. They don't understand it all. We know, because I mean, I did a conference on this, as I said last week, a lot of women aren't even messing about with AI. They haven't even looked at it. They don't even know what it is. It's being controlled, unfortunately, because men are playing with it by men. That's not a dig against men. It's just the fact that women aren't stepping up to the plate. Are there plans for anything to be put in place on this that you know of, or is that something that's being discussed?
I imagine it will be something that's discussed, and there's already some portals in place to give parents some insight into some of the challenges around chatbots and around some of the harms on social media. I mean, I know that we're looking as a country very closely to the Australian experience. I know that they have introduced some training for parents around all of this online. And I met with some of the providers of that training just a couple of weeks ago. And if I remember correctly, so far a couple of 100,000 parents in Australia have accessed this online training. So I hope that, if whatever we bring forward, that we are able to equip parents and to give them some insight and skills and knowledge to best help them. So it can be collective effort to give our kids their childhoods back, to really help them in terms of their online experiences, to help kids build their communities and their identities offline, and that and when they are on online spaces, that they are doing so safely.
Really hope so. And I'm conscious that there's still so much work to do and that we don't have all the answers. And I'm immensely grateful for you sharing as much as you have, and actually sharing it with me. As I said before at the beginning of the podcast, I mean, it's actually incredible to have really honestly, I can't tell you how incredible it is to have you here today. I suppose before we close off on the podcast, have you got any other messages that perhaps we haven't brought out in the podcast today that we should land as part of the podcast? I would encourage, and offline, we make sure that all the links that we've talked about today for the consultation and any other information that we've spoken about on the podcast, I will share in all of the links, whether that's on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, whatever. But I'm just curious of where we are with this now. Is there anything else we should be leaving our listeners with to consider, and why they need to be involved in shaping this decision for the United Kingdom and for history, really?
I would say that wherever your listeners are in the world, be that here in the UK or beyond, if they have concerns about what's happening in our online spaces, and particularly the impact of what's happening on our children and young people, that it's incumbent, I think, on us all to raise these issues and concerns, legitimate concerns, with our elected representatives. It certainly had an impact in the UK, but it needs to continue having an impact for elected MPs to know how important this issue is to so many people, and to understand the very real life consequences it is happening, on countless families up and down our country. And those representations, be that a Facebook message, be that, an email to your MP, showing up at a surgery appointment, or whatever it is that you have in your country, the opportunities to engage with your elected representatives, they do matter and they do make a difference. And so I would encourage anyone listening to involve themselves formal government consultations where that opportunity presents, but also to do so proactively through direct communication.
Thank you for that. And, I'm just going to, because I always try and remain devil's advocate, I will say that there will be people here that will be totally opposed to all of this, as there always are in life,
Oh,
of
yeah.
course. And it's good to have those voices because we need to understand them. But from my point of view, if anybody, I would love people to comment on this podcast after you. We will be sharing all of your comments back to Luciana. And I don't know if you know Luciana, but at the end of all of my podcasts, I do quite a big reflections on what we recorded. And I do challenge our listeners to take some of those messages away. But for the naysayers, I guess really I'd be really interested to hear from them about what their real protection or worries are, because at the end of the day, we are trying to give the innocence back to our children. We are trying to safeguard. And I think the word safeguard is really important here as well, right? Because we send our children to school to safeguard them and being ready for the future. And we try to give them all the right tools and techniques that we possibly can to get them fit to be able to be the next generation in work. And this is really just part of that.
Brilliant.
We've had the most fascinating conversation today. My brain is actually whizzing around immensely for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing the results of the consultation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dee. Good to chat to you.
So I took some time before I recorded these reflections to think back on the conversation that I had with Baroness Luciana Berger. And I guess what stays with me from her first story is the way that she talked about getting into politics, about her squiggly career. It reminded me that careers simply aren't linear anymore. They just don't move in a straight line, and they don't need to. I've often spoken about my career here, and it's certainly been a squiggly one. We can really work in so many different ways today. And I guess that's the upside of some of the technology that we're seeing. And that's where I'd like us to think about where we are today. I think Luciana is a brilliant example of that. And I'm delighted that she started to share that and what she shows now, that there are many different pathways of how you can get there in life to do what you really want to do. And actually that you can take quite a big turn from one way or another. But then, as I thought back to everything that she said, there was the scale of what she's actually working on. Probably two of the most iconic, emotionally charged, and historically significant issues of our time. Whilst we didn't get into the assisted dying bill much, she did mention how much work she had already done to question whether we should have the safeguards in place. Will there be safeguards in place? And what will we do to ensure that if we do have an assisted dying bill, that we do it with all the safeguards in place? But the main podcast, as we know, was really about, are we going to have a social media ban for under 16-year-olds? Both of those bills, I will say, are totally and utterly monumental. And they both require enormous effort, understanding, and time. And also to see the things that we don't see. What's actually going on behind the scenes? What's going on the dark web? What's going on in other parts of the big world wide web that we don't yet know? That's the role that Luciana has been bringing, not just to the House of Lords, but also to the House of Commons. But what came through here so clearly for me in this conversation was just about how much work she's done to build what I think is a really rounded, evidence-based view of what she believes, along with many others, which was evidenced in the podcast, really need to happen now around the social media bill. I think when I started to think about putting this podcast together, we were thinking very clearly that it was a ban. I'm not so sure it's a full-on ban, but it's certainly looking at the restrictions and the rules and the policies that we're going to make to protect our children. One of the pilots that she talked about was the pilot in Barnet, where schools now actively ban smartphones into school. We talked about the influence of chatbots. That was something that when she started looking at this wasn't there and has now come into play. And there will be other things that we don't yet know that will probably come into play. So this view of being agile with whatever we decide today, I think is vital. And agility is what we need in all change as we move forward into this digital sphere that we're in. She didn't just talk about chatbots and the influence of chatbots. She talked about the rise of screen time and the shocking figure that she shared. 21 hours, you may say, is that all a week? That wasn't just on screens. That was just on social media. She talked about 21 hours a week just on the social media apps that didn't take into account anything else and was only the tip of the iceberg. Because it's not 21 hours, is it? It's 21 hours of one thing that derives from being on a screen. It's 20 hours of the most sophisticated, addictive apps that are out there. Before I did my reflections, I asked a few people in my circle about how many hours they felt kids were online. Most of them said 5 days out of 7, most parents told me. Wow. Added to that, the 21 hours, we have a big problem. So whether they're on screens, whether they're in chat rooms, or whether they're on social media, 5 days out of 7 really struck me. But what's more, it really saddened me, especially when Luciana and I compared our childhoods, when we were allowed to be innocent, where we didn't know everything, where we weren't exposed to everything. We played outside, we got muddy, we rode our bikes. We didn't have many tools to communicate, but we were naive. And that naivety was a kind of a protection, I feel. I know I stayed naive well into my 20s, but that's not the case today. And that's simply not the case for our children or grandchildren today. I talked about what I noticed as a mother and a grandmother. I'm sure you'll have your own reflections on that as you're listening to this podcast. The heightened chances of grooming, self-harm, suicide, FOMO, comparisons, anorexia, the exposure to adult material, all of it has just multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And then she said something that genuinely floored me. The Snapchat app. How many of you have given that to your children thinking that it's the safest app out there, when actually it's the most dangerous, most sophisticated app for grooming, for online bullying, and for real world harm? And yet, the one we tend to give our children first is Snapchat. I immediately phoned my brother and told him that, as he had just given his eldest child Snapchat. We also talked about preparing young people for work, something that I'm hugely keen on with my own business, Work Ready Collective. We talked about that actually taking them off some of the social media apps and taking them off screen time would actually help them. Why? Because even the 2 major teaching unions believe, and because of that, they would support the bill, that we need to have an opportunity to allow children to understand how to socialize, understand how to be empathetic, understand how to debate, and understand to communicate effectively together and work things out in person, not online. In fact, she even talked about some of that online, hindering them on how to do it in the real world, face to face, eye to eye, voice to voice. So how do we ensure that whatever bill we get, that we have proper age verification? We know that there will always be people that go around the rules. She talked about smoking, she talked about alcohol. Of course, I'm sure there's children that can get hold of cigarettes and there's children that can get hold of alcohol. But in the main, it works. In the main, you can't buy it. You can't have it. Don't we want the same for the social media platforms that we're talking about today? We want to stop assuming that a child is just 13. We want to put in proper safeguards. We want to make sure that they have the right checks and balances. Mostly, I think we're all agreed, we just want safety. Luciana also brought in the medical perspective, the rise of anxiety, the rise of pressure on people like CAMS, on therapy, the wait lists getting longer. I talked about my children and how I see a much greater rise in anxiety, not just with my children, but my grandchildren. The lack of resilience, the lack of communication, the difficulty that we see arising in all our young people today. Is this really because we haven't put in the right safeguards? Because we didn't know? Because we didn't understand? For me, all of that came through the conversation that I had with her today. And then she said something I keep thinking about. And I've said this already in my reflections, but I'm going to say it again. We protect our children fiercely to the physical world. We try not to let them walk home alone before they're 11. We try not to let them be in the dark before they're 11. We don't let them drive without taking a test. We don't let them swim without supervision. But yet, somehow, online, in the safety of our most precious places, our home, we give them almost total freedom, not because we want to, but because we don't understand the scale. We don't understand what they're exposed to. She mentioned that perhaps they've been a social experiment. Maybe they have, but even though she's been going as far as she has with all of this work and everything it's taken for her to understand this, she still didn't know the half of it until she started working on influencing this bill, trying to change the legislation and trying to make sure that every parent, carer, mother, father, grandfather, grandmother, everybody out there, carer, feels so deeply. And that is to protect our people, to protect our future generations, our children. She also mentioned that close to 800,000 young people can't find work and how all of this is removing their skills to be work ready. Just another detriment and another bash on the head for these poor kids. What should we do? We really need to listen. That's what we should do. We should join the conversation. We should get on board with the consultation. Open now, right now. The consultation is open, and it is open till the end of May. And it's open to anybody over the age of 10 years old, which I think is astonishing because they will really listen to all voices. She also talked about Daniel Einstein's work in Australia. She talked about how the impact on climate anxiety, social media anxiety, and the heartbreaking reality that our children are now taking their own lives because of what they're seeing online. I loved how she talked about the precautionary principle that we have in this country, and that once we can evidence the harm, you can act. So let's act. Let's think about everything that she said. Let's get safety in our algorithms. Let's not have them stripped away. Let's make sure all the harms are visible. The question is, for me, to you, do we have the courage now to protect our children? I've been thinking that I came onto this podcast thinking, yes, we should have a ban. Should we have a ban? Shouldn't we have a ban? Are we having a ban? But actually, I think it's more than that. I really think it's about the time. By the time you listen to this, and I hope you've listened to it in time to vote, to have your say, to give your views to the consultation, because there's only 8 weeks from the day that this podcast goes out on April 2026 to the end of May 2026. So please have your say, stand up, be counted, make sure that we protect the most vulnerable and that they are not preyed upon. And that I believe now, having listened to everything and reflected, that we have a duty to put safety at the heart of everything that we do. I don't believe we'll get a full ban, and maybe that's okay, but I do believe that we need precautionary policy and legislation that ensures all our children are safe, anywhere, anytime, any place. So I urge you now, go online, look at the links that I've left in this podcast and have your say. The last thing that I do want to add in is polling has already shown that 75% of people in this country want to ban or some form of policy to protect under 16-year-olds online. 250,000 people contacted their MPs before the vote. So the concern is real, the need is urgent, and the conversation is only just beginning. Just before I go, I just want to make one correction to my podcast. I mentioned about the Louis Theroux Manosphere program. If anybody's seen that, I had said that it was on the BBC. I do apologize. It's actually on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, it's really hard-hitting viewing. If you have seen it, you'll know how I feel. But actually, the work that Louis Theroux is doing and has done in making this program really tells you everything about the scale of the problem. If I haven't brought it through on the podcast, Louis Theroux will bring it through on his program. I've been campaigning myself because I got caught out in what I thought was a safe chat room environment, in a B2B environment and a B2C environment. And we were caught out. And I'm now campaigning for some safety for women to be able to walk into a Zoom room and be protected. So if it can happen at work, it can happen at home. Let's go out there and make safer environments for us all, whether we're going to school, whether we're staying home, or whether we're going to work. So my last question is, are you ready to help keep our children stay safe in this completely unknown territory. I'd love to know what you think. I'd love to know what you think of this episode or any other episode. And I've really been humbled to have the chance to speak to Baroness Luciana Berger about what it takes to get a bill noticed, understood, and move forward. So thank you to everyone. Please feel free to share, subscribe, or leave a message below. Thanks for listening.